let's get started with today's webinar. And trust me, it's a very, very exciting topic, something which I'm also very passionate about. The topic for today is smart technology and innovations that will change your future. And we have someone very special amongst us. Like Anandamani said, he's the founder of the San Francisco Science, a storied global tech incubator, the founder and advisor to the French-American Society of Entrepreneurs, and the founding member of the New York-based Triana group. He's also the subject of a Harvard Business School case study titled The Jerry Sanders Case, which describes how, with an investment of only $180,000, he successfully sold his medical device company for more than $33 million in less than 10 months. Previously, Sanders served the Israeli Navy as a SEAL. So if you're excited about today's webinar, type yes in the chat box. Let's build up the energy before I bring on the speaker. So type yes in the chat box. Brilliant. Looks like our audience is warmed up. So with a huge round of applause, I know that I cannot hear an applause, but still give it up for Mr. Sanders.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for these kind introductions. Thanks for joining me in this conversation. I am Jerry Sanders. I'm an attorney. I'm an entrepreneur. And I'll be talking to you for a little over 15 minutes, after which I'll be glad to take your questions and comments and any other musings you have about the future. I've been invited, as your presenters have said, to talk to you about the future. In other words, in effect, to predict the future. But as I was preparing this talk, I realized that prediction is very difficult, especially when it's about the future. One thing I can promise you with certainty, the future will not be what you think it will be. The future will surprise you just as the advent of the coronavirus surprised the world, just as the collapse of the Soviet Union surprised the West, and just as the disappearance of Nokia surprised the technoverse. But before proceeding with my predictions, I'd like to share with you some of my favorite quotes about predictions. I'll begin with a cautionary quote about people who predict, and one that is apt for all of you today who have joined to hear me make predictions. The prediction is thus: those who have knowledge don't predict, and those who predict don't have knowledge. Now that's a quote from Lao Tzu, who was a 6th century BC Chinese philosopher. In other words, a quote from 2,600 years ago. And I, Jerry Sanders, a 21st century not Chinese philosopher, predict that 2,600 years from now, people will still be quoting him. Any one of you care to wait around to see if I'm right? Okay, some professions and some professionals are always making predictions. Economists, for example. Are there any economists here today? You can type in your little chat box and let me know. An economist is an expert who will know tomorrow why the things he predicted yesterday didn't happen today. Indeed, for the most part, economic forecasting, or any forecasting for that matter, is the art of saying what will happen and then explaining why it didn't happen. I guess we now know that we can say the same things about epidemiologists. The noted economist Paul Samuelson said that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. For example, according to one economist, the Wall Street Journal predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. Think about that for a moment. Now, I'm not making fun of economists because it's not just economists who get the future wrong. In 2006, for example, David Pogue, a New York Times technology and science journalist, no less, and an Emmy-winning correspondent for CBS News, predicted that Apple will never come out with a cell phone. And of course, right on cue, just a few months later, Apple released its first iPhone. But the quote that holds the most truth is this: the best way to predict the future is to invent the future. So with that said, let's talk about inventing the future. And let's start with the future of transportation, which is in fact the main topic I was asked to address today. Consider that surface transportation as we know it has not changed much since the advent of the automobile. Yes, there have been some obvious changes: faster cars, better stereo systems, more chrome, then less chrome, but no true game changers. And yes, self-driving shared cars will make a difference, but not that great a difference to qualify as a global game changer. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about incremental change. I'm not talking about adding the three-point shot to the game of basketball or adding a pinch hitter to the game of baseball. I'm talking about true game changers, going from cricket to Quidditch and doing so in the blink of an eye. So how does one innovate on a scale that changes everything? Well, if we look at surface transportation, today's drivers of change, as I mentioned, are computerization and sharing. Overall, these are welcome developments, and they'll have a positive impact on all sorts of things, among them traffic accidents and congestion. But evaluated closely, they're mere incremental changes. We've had computers in cars for 2 or 3 decades now. So really all that's changed with self-driving cars is the scope of what those computers are doing. Instead of your car beeping when you reverse, you now beep and your car reverses. As to sharing, well, we've been sharing in Europe since 1897, when Gottlieb Daimler built the world's first dedicated taxi cab. And we've been sharing in the USA since 1918, when Walter Jacobs started the Hertz Corporation. So to be a game-changing development, we'll need to see something dramatically and fundamentally different than that we have today, something that is not surface transportation. But we probably won't. Why not? Because the surface infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels, infrastructure that costs billions of dollars has already been built by someone else, and it's already in place. And no government is eager to spend that kind of money again. No government wants to take on massive infrastructure costs unless it absolutely has to. When do you see a new bridge? Only when the old one collapses. Obama, for one example, President Obama, came into office promising to fund what he called any shovel-ready infrastructure project. When he left office 8 years later, not one new project had been launched. Because the politicians who could authorize innovative experimental projects are likely to be out of elected office long before those projects have become a reality. In other words, because they won't be there to cut the ribbon and the photo op, they're not keen to authorize such projects. Moreover, since by definition, innovative infrastructure for experimental transportation is untested, it is the rare politician who's willing to take such a high-profile risk. Well, what about something like those flying cars promised to us by the Jetsons cartoon in the 1950s? Not in my lifetime, I'm afraid, because takeoff, landing, air traffic control, costs, carbon emissions are all likely to deter this type of development for a long, long time. So if not flying cars, how about elevated cars? Cars that move on dedicated infrastructure that is above surface roads, the so-called personal rapid transportation solutions, the Skytran solutions. Well, over the years, we've seen several examples of these, and yet to date, none have been commercially successful, and none have been implemented in an existing urban environment as a mass transportation solution. In fact, aside from small demonstration systems in well-controlled environments, none have been rolled out anywhere. Why? Well, the problems with these technologies are legion. Cost of infrastructure, aesthetics of infrastructure, cost of system, capacity of system, technology fail-safes, government regulation, lawsuits, environmental issues. In short, if and when these systems arrive, they'll most likely be limited to airports and amusement park settings. They're unlikely to be adopted as a wide-scale practical solution to public transportation as we know it. What about underground tunnels like that on offer from the Boring Company, or hyperlink type transportation? Well, both are promising, but both are problematic. Infrastructure costs for these systems are high. Technical tolerances are demanding. Applicability to the urban suburban environments where the need is greatest is not feasible because of footprint and other engineering limitations. And the last mile problem is exacerbated, not solved. The last mile problem is how to get from your home to the station and from the station to your ultimate destination. And if you're at all familiar with commuter trains and their parking lot overflow, you know of what I speak. Now, please note, I just made a series of predictions and I'll probably be wrong on all counts, so don't take notes. Now, where does this leave us? It leaves us where the future is exciting because it's unknown, and the future has consistently turned out to be better than what the false prophets warned us it would be. Every time that in human history insurmountable problems appeared, they were somehow, well, surmounted. For one example, do any of you know what the crushing problem was in New York City at the turn of the 19th century? I'll give you a minute to write your answer in the chat box. Well, the crushing problem in New York City was horse manure. That's right, horse shit. In 1894, New York had a population of 100,000 horses, producing around 2.5 million pounds of horse manure a day. But just a few years later, cars began to invade the urban settings, and by 1912, cars outnumbered horses on the streets of New York. By 1917, the last horse car was put out of commission, and the issue of horse droppings quickly receded into the stables of history. Change was not a faster horse or a prettier horse, just as change will not be a faster car or even a self-driving car. It will be something completely different than what most of us can imagine. It may be a unique application of existing technology to existing modalities. It may be new technology allowing us to do new things, and it may be the elimination of the need to move around at all, or at least to move around in the way we are dependent on it today. COVID-19, for example, just gave us a sneak preview of what an urban, surface, transportation-free world may look like. Telecommuting, drone deliveries, city-free traffic, pedestrians, and bicycles. Who brings about game-changing developments? Here's a hint. It's rarely, if at all, those players or those companies who are in the arena today. Take, for example, computers. At one time, the word itself was synonymous with then industry giants, Sperry, Univac, Burroughs, DEC. Where are those companies today? Why did they disappear? How did they disappear? Who made them defunct? 2 words, Bill Gates. When a game-changing solution to an existing problem arises, when a new technology threatens to eliminate the then dominant technology, companies typically default to Dr. Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of death. These are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. Dr. Kubler-Ross, a noted American-Swiss psychiatrist of our era, was describing how we as individuals deal with death, but her insights are relevant to companies too. The only difference being that companies invariably get stuck on stage 1, denial. In this first stage, the company's in a state of shock. It goes numb, paralysis sets in, no change is possible because they're in denial. No one in the corporate hierarchy wants to acknowledge that the company's cash cow is about to die. No one wants to acknowledge that the new technology, the one that has just appeared on the rapidly approaching horizon, is going to change and disrupt old ways and well-ingrained habits. A company that's been selling cameras for $400 does not want to contemplate a world in which cameras cost $4. A company that has had a virtual monopoly on camera film doesn't want to contemplate a camera that doesn't use camera film. Few companies are structured to be nimble enough to adapt change while in motion and at high speed. And even fewer are structured in such a way so as to encourage the bringing of bad news to the CEO. Killing the messenger is still the norm, not the exception in corridors of power. So who typically does bring the future? Well, for incremental change, baby step changes that don't make a big difference, we can look to the companies in place. For example, Chrysler and Ford adapted ABS from aircraft to cars in the early 70s. ABS being automatic brakes. Coca-Cola introduced Coke Classic in 1985, hardly an earth-shattering change. So for game-changing, we have to look to the entrepreneur. And often it will be that entrepreneur with no prior in-depth familiarity with the industry within which he or she has innovated, because that person is not wearing blinders that have come by being steeped in the industry. And that person typically thinks of ideas that would never be contemplated by such industry. In this case, knowledge of how things work is not a benefit, but a hindrance to innovation. The proverbial hedgehog versus fox conundrum. The hedgehog, who knows everything about one thing, is like the corporation. It will bring about incremental change. The fox, who knows a little about everything, is like the entrepreneur. He or she will bring about the game-changing innovation. So when it comes to the future, the fox wins every time. Take, for example, a non-technological change that completely derailed a powerful industry. Until 1975, Hollywood was controlled by the major studios, Paramount, Columbia, MGM, Universal. It was those studios who decided what movies were made, who was to act in them, and who was to direct them. If you did not rise within the studio ecosystem, you were destined to be but a cog in its machine. Yet within one extraordinary week, literally, a non-studio executive, a lawyer by training and a talent agent by profession, Michael Ovitz, upended the industry by shifting power from the studio to the talent agent. How did he do so? Well, he recognized that the studio's power rested on having a lot of talent under strict contract. But as a talent agent, Ovitz knew that talent was mobile. And as a lawyer, Ovitz knew that contracts can be broken, changed, and yes, sometimes even ignored. So he went about to place more and more marquee name talent under his contract. And by doing so, he was able to dictate to the studios what movies were made, who was to act in them, and who was to direct them. By 1979, CAA, Ovitz's agency, had almost $100 million in annual bookings and was on its way to become Hollywood's largest, most innovative, and most important agency. By assembling package deals wherein CAA would utilize its talent base to provide directors, actors, and screenwriters to a studio, he shifted the negotiating leverage from the studios to the talent agent. Who is most likely to be the entrepreneurial game changer? It will be the fearless, bothersome, irritating person who simply won't go away, simply won't let go of her or his idea. Sometimes these individuals bring about extraordinary positive change, like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. And sometimes they bring about shame and disaster, like Elizabeth Holmes or Charles Ponzi. So what's my point? Nothing more than what I said at the start of this talk. Never make predictions, especially about the future. Now, I understand that it would be unfair of me to leave you without any predictions at all, since this is what your host promised you for attending this session. So here in rapid fire are several predictions, none of which I'm prepared to be quoted on. The first is that the big social media companies will be broken up and their content will be subject to government regulation. Here I'm speaking about Facebook, Twitter, and the like. I think we've seen even in this first political season, presidential debates, that there's growing disrespect and dislike of these mega corporations controlling our speech, controlling everything about us, and knowing more about us than any government census would tell our government. Presently, they're literally unregulated, and I think that government and politicians are going to come in one way or another, break them up or regulate them. Another prediction is that millennials support, that generation previously called Generation X, and those coming after it, their support for climate change measures is going to dramatically transform Wall Street, Main Street, and Silicon Valley. And with that support, environmentalism is going to move from what we call the romper room, the nursery, to the boardroom. This is a powerful market force. Not all companies have yet recognized this, but I can tell you, as an advisor and partner in a technology company that allows us to tan skins and hides to make high quality leather that does not use any chemicals or metals, this is something that is about to arrive on the scene, because millennials are not prepared to spend thousands of dollars on Gucci or Hermes or Chanel bags or on high quality items that are polluting the environment. And so we see more and more the end user demanding to know where the product is coming from and what its footprint, environmental footprint was. In addition, another prediction, with the advent of new technologies and existing technologies applied in new ways, water and energy will no longer be scarce resources. This is going to be a big change in our world, because presently, many of the wars and many of the economic disruptions have come to be because of the paucity of water and energy reserves. The middle classes are going to rebel against the myth of meritocracy. And what do I mean by that? We live in a world across the globe, in most of the big industrialized countries, where we are led to believe that with merit, with hard work, you will be admitted to the Harvards and Yales and INSEADs and best schools, and then you'll be able to progress. But what we're seeing now, and more data is coming out because we live in the era of big data, that simply is not true. The people who get into those schools, the people who get the good jobs, the people who rise much more rapidly and often exclusively above everyone else are those with family connections, those whose parents are wealthy, those whose parents went to those schools, those whose parents have key jobs. Now, this shouldn't be a big surprise because that's human nature, but it does shatter this myth that has always been prevalent in the United States and elsewhere, that if you just work hard, you will make it to the top. I think what we're finding is that that is the exception, not the rule. And I think what you're going to see is that these middle classes, really the backbone of economies, the backbone of political structure, are going to demand a change. I don't know what that change is going to be, but I think the myth of meritocracy is going to go away quickly. Here's another prediction. 5G will accelerate change across all vectors, including and especially cybercrime. And cybercrime is quickly going to surpass all other forms of crime combined. And so if one wants to look to a big growth industry, it's going to be in cyber protection and cyber crime. Choose your poison. Universal translators, a little handheld device that's going to be on your phone or some other instrument, is going to be in everyone's pocket. You will no longer come to a foreign country and struggle in trying to understand what people are saying, or you yourself trying to express yourself. And you see the first buds of that today, where you can take a picture of something in a foreign language and immediately have it translated. That's going to become very quick, very rapid. This is a matter of years. Education is going to change because we're going to be learning how to think, not learning facts, and we're going to be teaching how to search big data, because really, what's the point of knowing when the French invaded Britain if you can get it on your Wikipedia in a matter of seconds? What will matter is how to use Wikipedia, how to use your iPhone. And my final prediction is that the time for questions and comments will arrive now. So please, if any of you wish to ask questions or comment, I'll be glad to address it.
I think the last prediction is just right because we're opening the floor for questions. So if you have questions, do put it on the chat box. Really very insightful, Jerry. I think it was filled with a lot of insights. In fact, I have a question which I want to ask you. You spoke about transportation. What's your take on electric vehicles? Do you think it will take mainstream a lot more faster now, or still we are on the horizon of 7 to 10 years?
Well, the dirty secret about electric vehicles is that they are not presently less polluting than carbon vehicles. They're simply shifting the pollution somewhere else because the electricity required to charge those vehicles is typically coming from coal or other carbon sources. So you're generating electricity to charge those cars in a very polluting fashion. And then you have the problem of batteries, which presently no one knows what to do with. It's kind of like nuclear waste. When your Prius dies or your electric car dies, how do you dispose of the battery, which has a useful life apparently of 10 years, although people aren't quite sure about that. There's no real recycling program. And so if those things go into a dump, they're going to create massive water pollution. Now, we're seeing more and more electric cars, first because governments have been giving subsidies for them, and second because people want to do something about the environment, and an electric car seems an easy, quick way to do it because in their mind, this is reducing pollution. And also because it's cool. I mean, what the genius of Elon Musk and his co-founder was to realize that people will buy an electric car, even if it's very, very expensive, just because it's cool and to show off. And so that's how the Tesla came to be. And so I think we are going to see more and more electric cars. It'll be more quiet, but until we find a way to generate electricity in a sustainable fashion without burning coal or oil, they are not really going to reduce pollution dramatically.
Sure, sure. We have Satish who's asking, if you can throw more light on the flying car.
So the flying car is a wonderful idea. I mean, we all think about, wouldn't it be great to just get above this traffic and fly? But the issue presently, even though there are some prototypes out there, is you need a runway to take off and you need a runway to land. These are not vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And the reason they're not vertical takeoff and landing is that's very complicated and expensive to do. And so once you need a runway, then it really becomes impractical. Then you talk about, okay, well, maybe we can get a car that's more like a helicopter. And again, it's very expensive. It's going to require big, big regulation, massive infrastructure costs. And so it's not really on the horizon. I don't think, of course, I could be wrong and probably will be wrong. I don't think we're going to see flying cars practically used in our lifetime.
Okay, sure. We have a question by Mohan. He is asking, do you think, agriculture as a sector will be impacted by technology?
Oh, yes, it already is impacted by technology. I'm an advisor to a company, for example, that harvests fruit from very high trees and pollinates date trees through the use of a drone. This same company has drones that fly over the field and take measurements of each individual plant in that field, transmitted back to tractors that are waiting elsewhere with all of that data. And then the tractor goes out autonomously to each one of the plants that were identified and delivers to that plant specifically what the drone said that plant is lacking. And the drone does this through spectrometry. So it takes pictures, different types of pictures of these plants. It can then tell the tractor, go to tree number 3 in row number 5 and give it more calcium. And then the tractor goes out autonomously and does that. So you're going to see very high yields. You're going to see very effective mechanisms. You're going to see a reduction in manpower, in menial manpower in that regard. And we're going to see a massive move into tech agriculture, massive. It's already begun and it's going to continue.
Sure, sounds very interesting. Vignesh has a question. He is asking if COVID-19 will affect investments and starting new businesses in foreign countries.
Yeah, my personal belief is that the world is going to recover very, very quickly from COVID-19. I think once we have a vaccine, it will be like it never happened, but it will probably take about, I would say, a year, which is not a long time, for everything to come back to normal, because people have lost substantial amounts of money. Some businesses are going to go out of business. Government's going to be in debt. We're already inflating currency. So there's going to be a wait and see time period. But I can tell you, after 9/11 in the United States, which was a huge shock to the economy, it took about 3 or 4 months, but then everything bounced back, and stock market started to roar and jobs were back. So I think we're going to see a quick recovery from COVID-19. And I think even today, there are new startups that are being funded. What's not being funded? What won't be funded are anything that leads to congregation. I think we're going to be leery of congregation for some time. So if you're creating some sort of mechanism or something that's unique for people who are gathered together, whether it's at a football field or whether it's some other social media, social engagement, those are going to be stuck for quite a while until we realize and figure out how to act in this new environment of social distancing. Once there's a vaccine, I think everything's going to come back to normal.
Sure. So there's just this fear psychosis around Corona, but once we have the vaccine, we are back to where we were earlier.
I think once we have a vaccine, it's all back to normal. Just think about it. Look, we have flu that before vaccines would kill as many people, if not more, than coronavirus. And then once we had a vaccine, or once we knew how to treat the flu, mortality rates plunged downward, and the world continued to act normally.
Sure. And everyone's saying that work from home is the new in thing. That's going to be the future. What's your take on work from home?
What is the future? I missed that.
Yeah, the future is work from home, remote locations.
Yeah, I think what we've seen from the coronavirus is that work from home works, that you can work, that a lot of the jobs that required people to come to the office have been supplanted by the same people working from home. And I think that's going to force companies and going to create an opportunity to allow people to work from home, maybe requiring that they come in once or twice a week. But I think we're going to see a lot of work from home opportunity because companies have been able to survive doing that.
Right, and it's good in terms of cost reduction as well, in terms of
cost and traffic and pollution. It has huge benefits.
Right.
And again, with the advent of 5G and really fast internet and all of these opportunities to communicate more quickly, more reliably across great distances, it's definitely on its way. I mean, look at what happened to Zoom, the platform we're on now, because of COVID-19. Suddenly everyone is using Zoom and they're finding it to be appropriate for family gatherings and many other business meetings. So definitely we're going to see more work from home.
Sure. Satish, you have a question?
Yeah. Jerry, I have a question. One of the industry which is very badly affected by this COVID-19 is entertainment and events industry. So how do you see that technology will play a role in event and in the entertainment industry? What is that can really do for this industry? Technology can do for it.
Yeah, I think that's one industry. That's one of the industries that is going to suffer greatly. It is not going to come back as quickly as the other industries. However, with that said, what we're seeing across the world is that people are fed up with isolation and they're ignoring their government, even rules and regulations. People are just completely ignoring the government demands, and they're going out to the public arena, and they're going to restaurants, and they're going to the beach. And it's as though they're saying, you know, we've had enough. We're not going to continue this. If 1 or 2 or 3 or 4% of the population dies, so be it. But we can't continue to live this way. So I think we are going to see it come back, but it's going to take longer than other industries, especially sports. I mean, consider football, soccer, you know, basketball. These are tough venues to bring back to full use. The airline industry, there's some industries where we are used to being crammed in close together. And I think at least for a while, until there's a vaccine, people will be leery of going to these types of venues.
Sure. We have a question from Neela Kantan, and he's asking, what are the technologies and innovations to come into the medical industry since you've had great success in this domain?
I think we're going to see a complete transformation of the medical field. We're going to see many, many, many more robotic surgeries where the surgeons won't even have to be present in the same room as the patient. You may see, for example, a surgical clinic where there are top-notch surgeons who sit in New York and they do surgery on wealthy sheiks in Abu Dhabi remotely. Now, the robots are extraordinarily more precise than the best surgeon can be. They literally can move in nanomillimeters in such a fashion with no shaking or movement than the best top-notch surgeon. They can do it quicker. So when a surgeon is operating that machine, and it doesn't matter where that surgeon is, you're going to see great outcomes. You're going to see much more efficiency. And I think you're going to see that rather quickly. Another change coming fast are the implantables, all of the new devices that will allow us to replace organs. Some organs are already being printed on 3D printers with tissue. We're going to see stem cells coming in and replacing organs and healing heart attacks and strokes. And again, these things are coming quickly. Some of them are already being done. And we're going to see some exoskeletons. So if you remember in the movies, Avatar famously, where the soldiers are driving around these massive structures that are external to their body, I think we're going to see a lot of that, where people are going to be able to lift 100 times their weight using one of these exoskeletons. So again, it will make easier and faster all sorts of tasks that today take a long time, require a forklift, and so forth.
Right. Since we were speaking about robots, Santosh had a very interesting question. Do you ever see that there will be a replica robot for every person on Earth to achieve immortality?
Yeah. Well, you know, the objective of Singularity University and others is to try and, in effect, merge the person with the computer. Elon Musk has a company that is trying to do that neurologically. And I think we're going to see a lot of people trying to do that. I don't know what that's going to do to humanity. In other words, are we still people once we're in a computer? And if we can transfer all of our neurons in the brain into some sort of computer program and then continue to live in the computer, is that us or is that a computer? So that's best left for sci-fi movies.
We're surely living in interesting times. Okay, yeah. Prashant has a question. Would you put your money on waste management companies? Do you think that's the future, and then these companies will go on to become big if they innovate?
What type of management companies did you say?
Waste management companies.
Waste management companies. Yeah, I think depending on the technology, there's going to be a lot of demand for better waste management, meaning being able to separate out one type of waste from another, recovering precious metals from the waste, recovering rare earth minerals from the waste. trying to get the waste to a place where it can be used as fertilizer. And various organizations are demanding it now. For example, the European Union is requiring that waste not have more than certain parts per million of various chemicals. So that's going to be a big industry, a big growth industry.
Sure, sure. We have a question from Venkateswaran. He's asking, it's basically a series of questions. Any alternatives to single-use plastics, sanitization in the third world and developing nations, solid waste and liquid waste handling in the future? What are your thoughts on all of these?
And so we've touched upon that a little bit. I mean, I think what you're seeing in disposable products is the use of various disposable, recyclable materials like corn husks and natural biodegradable materials being used instead of plastic. Still very difficult to wean ourselves off plastic because it's inexpensive, it's easy to make, it's easy to use. The price of oil is low. I think it's going to continue to be low. And so it's a challenge because the only way people are going to stop using plastic is if government prohibits it. And that's something that politicians are not going to be excited to do, especially since they got a lot of money from plastic users and plastic companies. I think this goes back to the previous question about waste management. I think what we're going to see is a greater demand for better waste management as opposed to prohibition on the use of plastics.
Sure. So do you think businesses will be more responsible to the environment due to the pandemic? Now, it's become a reality check right now more than something glamorous. Because of the pandemic, do you think their social responsibility is going to kick in now?
Yes, I think it ties into what I spoke about earlier regarding millennials. I think there is among the millennials a much greater awareness and demand for social responsibility, social sharing. Unfortunately, what happens is millennials and X generation and Y generation grow up and become mature, and then they have more goods and they're less likely to want to share those goods. Everyone is a communist when they have nothing, and everyone is a capitalist when they have something. So it's a very difficult transition. If we could freeze the millennials in place, then maybe there would be a chance. But you look at the populist presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders, it's remarkable that a declared socialist in the United States, the bastion of capitalism, did as well as he did. And I think it's because of his populism and speaking to the issues of no real meritocracy, unfair distribution of wealth, and some shared responsibility that any society needs. So I don't know how quickly that will come about or if it's going to come about at all. I think it's going to come about. I think we've reached a tipping point where it's clear to people that there is no meritocracy. It's clear to people that there's a huge gap in wealth and that they're simply not going to put up with it anymore. You see it every now and then come in waves. It somehow stopped just before the critical moment, but those waves keep getting bigger and bigger. If you remember Occupy Wall Street from a few years ago, and then the Bernie Sanders insurgency. So these things are on their way.
Right, sure. You spoke about this earlier. One of our attendees is asking, is there less of a future for branded and expensive goods over economic products? Where does the branded market stand at this point of time?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that branding is still important and is still going to be important. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a very satisfying activity to wear a polo shirt, a shirt that has a little horse logo on it, because it psychologically puts you in a place of safety and comfort because you're wearing something that is recognized worldwide as being a quality product that is expensive. And yet you don't have to spend your inheritance buying that product. In other words, for another $4 or $5, you can get the polo shirt as opposed to just getting an unbranded shirt. And for the wealthy, it could be $3,000 or $4,000, and then for others, $30,000 or $40,000. But you're seeing that people are willing to spend that kind of money for branding and association with good brands. And if you look at the quarterly results of companies like LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Hermes, Gucci, part of the Kering Group, you see that their results are phenomenal. They continue to sell a lot of branded products at unbelievably high prices. And the difference between a Louis Vuitton bag, which is mostly plastic anyway, and a Coach bag or any other bag that is not branded, it's not that great, but people want to have the Louis Vuitton initial on their luggage.
Right. In fact, when China reopened, Hermes showroom had sales of $2.7 million in a single day. So
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
That's surprising. Okay. COVID-19 has expedited.
Just if I can add one small fact to that, people, when Starbucks started, Starbucks, the coffee chain started, some critics said, this is never going to work. Coffee costs, $1 at most. Nobody's going to pay $4 for a cup of coffee. But in fact, what Starbucks showed is that people are willing to spend a little bit more or even a lot more to get a product that is, viewed by the world as being a quality product and being better than just getting coffee at a coffee shop. And so no one, imagine, 10, 15 years ago, if you were to say to someone, you're going to pay $4 for a cup of coffee or $5 for a cup of coffee, they'd look at you like you were crazy. But today, everyone does that.
Sure. So guys, you heard it. Jerry is saying branding is going to be important. In fact, it could be the biggest differentiator between who you are and your competition.
Yeah.
Right. So COVID-19 has accelerated digital transformation. How do you see IoT coming in and making an impact here? Any particular businesses in particular?
Well, IoT, we're almost beyond the curve of IoT already. In other words, anyone who wanted to integrate various devices together is already doing so or has already done so. So IoT now may see incremental change, but I don't think we're going to see some massive leap, because you can be driving your car, and while driving your car, you can program your television and turn on the lights in your house and have your heater go on. And so all of that stuff is already here. I don't know what more beyond incremental change IoT is going to bring. It's going to be a part of our life. It's going to be more and more widespread, but I don't think it's going to be dramatically different than what we have now. We're going to see better user interfaces, but I think that's about it.
Sure. I have a question. In fact, I wanted to ask this for a long time, and now have someone who can really do justice to it. So how do you make predictions? Is it just relying on historical data or user patterns? How do you really make a prediction? Because sometime back there was this whole hype on wearable tech, but it never lived up to its image. So how do you really make a prediction?
Well, I try not to make predictions because, as I said earlier, I think, typically predictions turn out to be wrong. The future turns out to be very, very different than what we imagined. Just consider that the United States spent untold billions of dollars spying on the Soviet Union, trying to know everything about the Soviet Union, and yet no one predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. And no one predicted it would collapse as quickly as it collapsed. So I think, you can spend a lot on the future and study the past and try and glean the future. We haven't yet seen it. Every year I'm approached by people out of the various business schools who ask me to fund this algorithm that they've invented or wrote that will predict the stock market, and that they'll be able to make billions because they're using all of this data from the past and all of these various signs from the past. And then when they come to implement it, it doesn't work as they thought it would work. Now, of course, there are hedge funds that use very sophisticated algorithms and they make money all the time, but they're catching very little blips. They're not catching really something massive. The collapse of the housing industry in the United States, for example, nobody among the big institutions saw that coming, or if they did see it coming, they didn't care because they were making money immediately at that time off of the housing industry, which they knew was in shambles. So we didn't have anyone at the time, or very few people at the time, and virtually none who were taken seriously, saying this is about to collapse. And therefore, I know of these ventures, especially, if I'm not mistaken, eBay has hired a brilliant scientist, really brilliant young woman whose purpose it is to examine data and predict the future from that data. There may be signs, but I don't think, as I said, surprises everywhere. Nobody saw COVID-19 coming, really nobody. We see how ill-prepared the world was for it. And there's a great book I recommend. It's called The Black Swan. And it's by a gentleman who ran a hedge fund and very knowledgeable and steeped in the financial industry. And he speaks about these once-in-a-lifetime events that unfortunately happen much more frequently than once in a lifetime. He says nobody's financial models predicted that 2 planes would fly into the World Trade Center, but it happened.
Sure. Interesting. In fact, you spoke about books. We have a question from Prabhu. He's saying 5 books we should read. I think 5 is going to be a huge number. At least your top 3 recommendation.
Well, there's The Short History of the World by an Israeli author. I can't remember his name right now, but it's an excellent book.
Okay.
And I'm reading a book now about the Silk Road, which is fascinating because you see that globalization is not a recent invention. It just took longer to get from one place to another. And the reason I mention it is because of the Chinese venture now, the Chinese government venture of in effect recreating the Silk Road using modern technology. So that's, I think, a very compelling book. And then I would say that any book by, name's escaping me, but the author of The Tipping Point and many other such books. I'll remember the name momentarily. I'll even look it up right now, and suggest that any of his books are fabulous books because they do come at, Malcolm Gladwell. So any
Right.
book by Malcolm Gladwell, I would say, is well worth the read.
Sure. Thank you for that. In fact, we have another question around similar lines. One good movie to watch, which is
movie, I'll tell you, my favorite movie is Glengarry Glen Ross. It's just a great look at the grind of people working in the raw capitalist system. And the famous book at the time of my parents was Death of a Salesman, which became a play and a movie and so forth, and also spoke about that grind. And Glengarry Glen Ross is a modern take on it. It's a great movie. And as to the other 2, I would say either Rocky 1 or Rocky 2 or Terminator 1 or Terminator 2.
Sure. Sounds interesting. So we're almost done with the questions. What have you been up during this lockdown? How have you been keeping yourself busy? Something different that you've done last couple of weeks?
My work is mostly, almost entirely on the telephone and my computer. So it hasn't been much of a change for me. I haven't been able to go to the beach as much, but my life has continued because I've been, commuting from home, working from home for many years now, and I find it much more enjoyable and effective than attending meetings. I think meetings are a scourge, and if you can avoid having meetings, one should always avoid having meetings because a lot of nonsense occupies most of the time in the meetings. What I have not been able to do is work with the counterparts on the other side. We have, for example, a couple of deals that we're working on with European companies, and so we've been dead for 2 months now because there's nobody there. You can't talk to anyone, you can't advance it, so a lot of these deals are stuck. And but aside from that, I'm hoping they'll all come back to work now and we'll be able to pick up where we left off.
Sure, sure. Let's hope the good times come back again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for taking time out and sharing your insights with us. It's been truly wonderful to have you on this webinar. Satish, Anandamani, if you can, come in and then just.
I see one question there I'd just like to address because I think it's a good one about
Sure.
3D printers. I think, yes, 3D printers are going to be an unbelievable accelerator for growth in every kind. If you remember back in the day when printers and copy machines were expensive, there were these centers, they still exist, but not as plentiful as they used to be, of shops where you would bring your computer or your USB adapter and print out documents, or send images to be printed out. I think someone who opens up a similar type of store for 3D printers is going to have a good 5-year or maybe longer run if they keep updating their 3D printers, because they're becoming cheaper and not everyone can afford them. Most people cannot afford them. They also have a big footprint, so you don't have anywhere to put them. And so if you open a Kinko's type store or copy print type store, and you have 3D printers where people can come in and you print out for them in 3D in whatever substance they want, and you can probably get financing for the machines themselves, that would be a good business. That's going to be a growth business.
Sure. There you go. We have a great startup idea as well. I'm sure Jerry will be able to fund you as well.